Hi, today I have with me Jonathan Grammer, CEO of US Carbon Capture, and he also has a related land and law practice, also known as a landman. Thanks for being here, Jonathan, to discuss
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
carbon. And I also just want to note that today is September 11th, and just wanted to take a minute to pause and pay respect to those whose lives were lost and impacted, just sort of honoring the memory. With that, I will sort of move to our topic for our discussion, which is carbon capture and its kind of interplay in this transitioning energy mix. And this is our second conversation that we've had. This is sort of a sequel. And so some people can look at the past one. I think it's like Frontiers of Carbon Capture. And just something that kind of to overview something we covered last time, just that the state of the market is that it's really in its infancy. It is fragmented. And at the moment, it's largely sort of subsidy driven. And there's a lot of dynamics to that. But I wanted to just start with direct air capture because there's been a lot of attention about direct air capture. And you mentioned earlier in a discussion just that there's a number of components that have to come together in carbon capture and storage, sequentially to make all the tech work.
Right.
Make it work. Can you kind of discuss that and how DAC fits into all that as well?
Absolutely. And, I'd respond to your 9/11 comments by reiterating my own on the way to school, as we do every year on this anniversary. My children ask me what I remember about that day. And one of the things that I remember the most that I hope to bring not only to the conversation about the country, but certainly energy is in spite of the fragmented environment we live in, is how unified the country was in the days and the weeks and months after that event happened. And I've always lived in yearning that somehow we'd, absent bringing a tragedy to serve as the catalyst, that we could find a way to preserve that sort of patriotic unity. And I think the energy discussion may be a good opportunity as a whole to bring everybody together to make the country stronger. But that's, to your point, and I'm grateful you brought that up. It's always the undercurrent of 9/11 is just to remember how patriotic the country really still is, I think, even though we forget about it some days. But
Yeah.
in answer to your specific question, the multiple components of carbon capture and storage all currently exist for the most part somewhere in the country in independent existence. You have CO2 pipelines that run in New Mexico, Colorado, and the Permian Basin. You've got class 6 wells for injection in Decatur, Illinois. You've got functioning monoethanolamine MEA solution capture facilities in Alabama. And the theory is that if we combine all of these components together, we can create industrial carbon capture on a large scale. And I think on average, from point source emitter, which is your industrial facility, which has CO2 coming up in an emission plume, to injection into a storage reservoir, there may be 6 or 7 very large variables that have to be completed within a very short time period, 5 to 7 years. And the odds mathematically, as many have seen in the financial world, where most of the private money still stays on the sidelines in CCS, the odds of being able to pull all of these stages off, successful capture, successful right-of-way, successful pipeline construction, successful seal preservation in your geological storage complex, successful lease project to obtain the pore space, injection, and permitting, for all of that to happen within the confines of your required timetable for a CO2 storage lease is very, very improbable, I guess is the word. As it relates to direct air capture, I think the bottleneck is being alleviated, or at least attempted to alleviate, by eliminating your emitters and foreseeably eliminating your pipeline by putting your direct air capture facility right over your storage complex. You don't necessarily have to find geological storage places right next to heavy industrial emitting hubs. And so all of these variables, 5, 6, 7, 8 things that have to happen, are foreseeably cut down, maybe even 30%, maybe more. And that, I believe, and from what I've observed, is what's maybe advancing the direct air capture conversation over your point source emitter projects.
Just one question that came to mind. From a land use point of view, are you saying that direct air capture, in fact, maybe it's more efficient on land use potentially, but I know it also requires, as we talked about, a lot of those facilities require a lot of energy and water. So you have
They
those
do.
resource requirements. So does that mean then that those have to be sited also in the right place, i.e., if they're out in the middle of nowhere, well,
Yeah.
they still have to get energy to them, and they have to have water, so you get back into that competition with resources. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, the discussion in carbon capture is you're trading something to get something else, and that's frustrating, and it's been perpetual and will continue to be so. The energy and water penalty is something that really hasn't. You're exactly right. You need to find these sort of collateral needs outside of the actual capture process. One is water to cool, the other one is power to run your equipment. And I don't say funnily enough, oddly enough, you don't see a whole lot of illumination to those two things. And maybe we even talked about this last time that we spoke. Even in some of the capital expenditure projections, and even in some of the feed studies that are out there, you're going to have that in direct air capture. You're also going to have that in your point source emitter processes. You're going to need water and you're going to need power and a lot of it. Now, less in direct air capture. I don't have my engineers on the interview, but it's my understanding. I think direct air capture has the potential to cool in with ambient air temperatures. It doesn't necessarily need, because the temperature for the separation process is not as high, maybe as your MEA process. And I'd be happy to explain what I mean when I say MEA process versus direct air capture. But DAC uses potassium hydroxide, which can separate the CO2 at a much lower temperature. So it requires less water availability, although it does require some. Certainly in West Texas and the Permian Basin, any volume of fresh water that you're going to be needing for your processes is going to be difficult to find. Even in places in South Texas and Central Texas, we're seeing aquifer problems. So yeah, your locations are going to be heavily dependent upon not only where is your geology appropriate, but where are your emitters relative to that, but also how much availability of fresh water and how are you going to get the additional megawattage to run whatever process that you need to do, be it a direct air capture fan or your regeneration and stripper columns for point source emitters. Both are going to use a great deal of electricity to get that done.
Yeah, so it sounds like, there's supply chain issues either way you look at it, whether you go the direct air capture route or whether you, like you said, you're building transmission pipelines between emitters and ultimate users and all that. So what does that mean then in terms of, you talked about that there's a lot of CCS money sitting on the sidelines. What is a driver of that in your mind? Like, why?
I think that response to your first question, and we weren't interested in obtaining private equity backers. We still aren't. And that's not because we're adverse to what they bring to the equation. That's not the equation we're looking to put together. But those were some of the first individuals that we really started talking to about our project ideas, purely to get their thoughts on the economics. If they thought the economics would work, we're all scientists and engineers and lawyers. We're not financial CFOs. And so it's not necessarily the language we speak, but we were interested in that language. And what we observed was, to your point and to mine, there's too many variables that can go wrong. We see that there may be a false narrative in assuming that because we can successfully put CO2 in pipes and we can capture it in certain facilities and we can store it in certain facilities, that all these things are going to work to the same probability when we try to combine them together.
Mhm.
And the odds were bad. And the rate of return was too long. Most of these people wanted 3 years and 4 years and 52 months. And this was 7 to 8 years. Some of these injection timetables realistically are 2030, and got phenomenal feedback. Great idea, but there's no way we can get our money back in the time needed. And two, I think probably the odds of you being successful at bringing all of these things together at once is much, much lower than perhaps the industry would suggest. In Texas, there's still a lot of regulatory work to be done. We don't have post-closure liability rectified like we do in states like Montana.
Right.
We don't have primacy has not been granted, and we don't have statutory codification of pore space, although common law would suggest that it vests with the surface owner. From an investor standpoint, those things that are traditionally risk averse, those things need to be reconciled before you're going to see this money move to center.
Yeah.
And those are the things that have come up in conversations that we've been involved in that are keeping private money on the side. Now, I'm confident it will slowly start to move.
Mhm.
And every 3 or 4 months, every 6, you see a little bit more migration and conversation of wanting to invest as the market for carbon capture becomes clearer to even people on our team. And let's be honest, when you have an emerging market, it's not going to be clear in the beginning.
Yeah.
I'm actually grateful that private money didn't just jump right into it.
Yeah.
Because they're based on a lot different logic than those of us that are in the sciences rely on. And I think that's pretty valuable feedback.
Yeah. One thing I was going to ask, just because this kind of came to mind in this discussion, is, Exxon bought Denbury, and obviously they have a big CO2 business, established pipelines, things like that. What do you think is the motivation there, and what's the play? How might they play those Denbury assets forward? And it sounds like an Exxon, with deep pockets, they're
Right.
a good place for carbon capture to be, taking off, so to speak. Maybe.
I have 2 theories, and that's all that they are. We have some good relationships with people that have worked and continue to work with Denbury. Obviously, that's not a conversation that comes up. What is the path forward? But just purely as an observer, what makes sense
Yeah.
in watching that acquisition? One, Exxon, while fully integrated, probably needs a midstream component that's more experienced with CO2 if it wants to continue to do capture, move into capture along the Gulf Coast, which we've seen Exxon look at participating in that space, but also in plants closer into the interior of the United States. Exxon has funded in the past feed studies to see if capture was possible. So I think they need a CO2 midstream component to their business model moving forward, which I think obviously is going to involve CCS. They're the ones that projected it to be a $4.6 trillion industry over the next 5 to 10 years. And the other is that they probably see the bottleneck that I iterated earlier in our interview, that Class 6 storage is going to take too long. And this carbon dioxide, once successfully captured, could probably be utilized for enhanced oil recovery.
Yeah. Right.
Just being a major oil producer, the major oil producer in the world,
Yeah.
that just seems obvious to me. Whether that's correct or not, I can tell you we're having that conversation quite a bit internally as we look at the length of time. I was on a call earlier this morning with somebody with knowledge, suggested that the Class 6 permit approval process, I believe in South Dakota, is projected to be somewhere between 4 to 6 years presently.
Wow.
Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But a lot of money is going to burn out in the meantime.
Yeah.
And we haven't talked a great deal about what enhanced oil recovery is, what it entails, and why it may be an attractive alternative to classic storage. But one, you've got proven geology. Two, it can create an immediate revenue stream if you're successful. And there's an abundance of legacy oil fields in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and those areas in the deep South where Denbury already has a pipeline infrastructure and a knowledge base.
Right.
Whether that's what Exxon intends to do, I don't know.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. And it's also interesting that, just from the midstream point of view, that's maybe where some of this could end up lying.
Well, and keep in mind too, when I say midstream, there's a misconception that we're running into. We're running into a lot of misconceptions. And one of them is that if you play in the natural gas space, then you can play in the CO2 space. Early on, I remember even hearing commentary that Texas was ripe for CO2 infrastructure because we have so many abandoned natural gas pipelines. Mm-hmm. Moving natural gas and moving CO2 are two completely different things. They move at different pressures. The pipes require different pressure ratings, different compressors. A lot of different science is utilized. And so there is an obvious potential that Denbury has, second only maybe Kinder Morgan, or more so than KM, has the corner on the market because there aren't any other midstream companies that have a lot of experience moving carbon dioxide.
Right.
A lot of big gas companies, but being able to move natural gas effectively and have the pipelines for it and the engineers and the people that do it, and natural gas, it doesn't easily translate into CO2 like a lot of people think. And so if you're looking for pipeline people to move CO2, acquire a company that already knows how to do it. And, that makes sense. So it's important that your audience know that moving natural gas and moving CO2 are going to be completely different things.
Yeah, completely. Just kind of switching gears, we had talked a little bit about emitter dynamics, and that, that there was some, you just haven't seen the movement that you thought you might see in them adopting CCS in a way that would move the needle. And what was the dynamic that you had mentioned on that?
You mean what maybe some of the causes behind that?
Yeah, why they're
I'll tell you something that was interesting that was brought to our attention that I hadn't thought of before, was that the companies are under a lot of pressure. A lot of companies are under a lot of pressure to decarbonize, but a lot of companies are under an enormous amount of pressure, not only to decarbonize, but to fuel switch away from fossil fuels. I personally believe, I will interject my opinion, that that's unfortunate, because I think it's entirely unrealistic on a large scale.
Yeah.
But at the present time, that does have the lion's share of the discussion is not only are we going to decarbonize, but we're going to move away from using coal, natural gas, and oil. If somebody commits, and this is just based on what we have experienced and heard from others, this doesn't speak for the whole. But if an industrial facility, an industrial corporation is going to commit to carbon capture and storage as a way forward to decarbonize, then they simultaneously are also admitting to their shareholders that they intend to continue to burn fossil fuels. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to engage in it. Yeah. And there's some hesitancy there. I think the resistance against fossil fuels is continuing to dissipate slowly. I think it'll dissipate greatly in the years to come. And at that particular juncture, then you will start to see more corporate boards and corporate policies adopt carbon capture, because they may not be under the heat that they are now. Yep. To not only decarbonize, but to defossil fuel themselves.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting conversation when we were approaching emitters with offtake agreements, letter of support agreements, memorandums of understanding, maybe even a joint venture, of people really interested in carbon capture, but really interested in the phone call they were going to have to make afterwards to say, we just inked up an agreement to participate in carbon capture, and letting everybody know that already has eliminated their emissions, that they intend to continue to burn them.
Right. Yeah, they don't want to cross the narrative. And that's a dangerous thing, because that is, that is not necessarily the financially sound move.
Sure. And
But
I think people need to understand emitters are in a really difficult spot. I'm not expecting them to move very quickly
yeah,
because they have a lot of multi-tiered decisions to make.
yeah,
And if it is in fact going to be fuel switching, you hear all the discussion about hydrogen. They're entertaining one way or the other. They're entertaining massive capital expenditures for massive infrastructure changes to positively affect or negatively reduce their carbon emissions. So these are not going to be quick decisions.
yeah.
So again, like private equity, I don't fault them for necessarily taking their time. I just think maybe the general population thought it would move faster than it has.
Right, right. The markets, I think are, have been onto that, the stock markets
Right.
and stuff.
Sure.
And that actually kind of gets to, I'm going to kind of skip into this since we're kind of nearly there. This sort of gets into the discussion about the IRA legislation, because what we're talking about basically is that this IRA legislation, incentivizes hydrogen, CCS, renewables, EVs, battery storage,
Mm-hmm.
all of it. It's all about decarbonization and or fuel switching. And there's a lot of subsidies. They're uncapped. They're tax credits that are uncapped.
Yeah.
It's creating a lot of new business models that, may not be the right way forward.
Right.
There's a lot of hot money, in fact. And so it's not the smart money.
No.
So what can you say? I know that you had a few examples actually of how you've seen these tax credits attracting investors, and
Playing out.
what's your color on that?
Um, and I try to be clear that just because I have a company, a team that has a lot of experience and believe very strongly in carbon capture, that translates into us believing how it's being stimulated and compelled. And
Right.
that's not the truth. I'm not 100% averse to the IRA nor the elevated tax credit. Uh, I would prefer, though, that it wasn't there, to be honest with you, because it's really preventing a carbon price from being established. And prices are the definer of all.
Right.
I believe it solves just about everything. It establishes supply and demand. It's a result of supply and demand, and it's very good at establishing what social morals are and what we really want the market to be.
Yeah.
If we want this market to sustain itself long term, the iteration I need to hear from the market is how much are our consumers willing to pay for decarbonized products,
Yeah.
steel and concrete? What does a market sustain? What can a market sustain is a price per kilowatt hour.
Mm-hmm.
What are we willing to mark up our utility rates for to pay for the supplier of that energy to decarbonize? That is impossible to establish if
Mm-hmm.
it's being subsidized.
Right.
That narrative has been taken away by the IRA. I'm not blaming the legislators that passed it, nor the legislation itself, but it is the unintended consequence is that with that in place, that market cannot arise on its own.
Yeah.
I think it's the belief that if you fund something in the beginning with Department of Energy money, and they may be right, that it will give the market time to come up behind it.
Mm-hmm.
But as I've told people before, the lion doesn't run because he's fast. The lion runs because he's hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And when you've taken that momentum out of the market, then you have people that are really just there for what you called hot money,
Mm-hmm.
free hot money.
Yeah.
It'd be interested to see when that money runs out,
Yeah.
the players that are left.
Right.
And what we need is the smart money people. And again, I don't want to ever give the impression I'm criticizing those that have moved into this space. We certainly have. But we're working really, really hard to keep it as private as long as we can so that we can be a part of bringing about that equation that I've said before exists in saltwater disposal is
Yeah.
an industrial supplier of it has decided what they want to pay to someone to take it away, and that person has decided what they want to pay to get rid of it under someone else's property, and it works. It's very simple. It's very basic. I'd love to see it applied to carbon dioxide so we know exactly how much this pollutant is worth
Right.
to the market. What we are seeing in specific examples is that with all the sluggish movement in the United States of moving into carbon dioxide emissions captured through CCS, there's a great deal of foreign money that has showed up to get these tax credits, which we haven't talked about. At $85 a metric ton for a million metric ton a year emitter, that's $85 million over the life of that facility. That's a lot off your money, especially if it comes in the form of a direct payment. And we have had multiple interest calls from the East with large checkbooks with the intent of buying domestic facilities with the sole purpose of obtaining these IRS tax credits, because you don't have to be an American. You can contract for them, you can buy them, you can trade them on the markets. They're valuable here, but they're also valuable all over the world. And I think that likewise is maybe an unintended consequence that people don't see, that our taxpayer funds could subsidize American work. It could also subsidize foreign efforts as well. And that's a narrative I haven't seen in the media, but it's certainly one that I've experienced in my work.
Yeah, well, I have a feeling it's going to come up.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too, in getting back, because these discussions are like opposite sides of the coin, and that is, the price of carbon, and there's there's different markets around the world, and we have a couple of our own, what they call, I can't remember the term, but there's voluntary and involuntary carbon markets, and we've got one in the Northeast, and then on the West Coast as well,
Right.
where they're trying to figure out price discovery, because price discovery is like where it's at. Like you said, the bottom line is, what will we pay for that? Because it's additional for now. It's just like if you're buying organic fruit, you're going to pay more for organic fruit. This is like organic energy, you're going to pay more, to have it decarbonized, right? It's inflationary. And that's been discussions I've heard from economists and things like that. And, but if there's a value to it, which we know there is, in terms of reducing air pollution, reducing, the heating planet, doing what we can with the science that we have, then it makes sense, and we have to figure out a way to price it, and that it seems like that's the nut of the whole story in a way.
It is. It's not very easily discussed because it's not real emotional. It seems very, when you reduce things down to the economics, they're not as popular to talk about. But I explain it to people in talking about, the phrase, buy, people who like to buy made in America. It's Patriotic Day. Let's talk about it. At what price do you want to buy your Ford F-150, a car that's 100% assembled in Detroit? At somewhere, you're going to find that breaking point where someone who only wants to buy a product that's made in the United States of America is going to throw their hands up and say, no, that's too high. I will trade that for a foreign product because now you're charging me too much for what I'm really trying to obtain. And that's very similar to carbon emissions. Is I want to have decarbonized power. I want to reduce the footprint in the environment. We don't know right now what people want to pay. If they were in fact prepared to pay for all of it now, there'd be no need for government subsidy. People would be outside of companies that supply different products and want to buy something. I'm not buying your product anymore as long as it emits carbon dioxide. That's not necessarily happening.
Right.
And so it's going to make it really hard to establish what that price is, but that's exactly where I think this needs to go.
Right. Yeah, because what it is, it's a green premium. It's a premium price on things.
That's right.
And some can pay, and those that can pay, but that gets to these EVs. There's a huge, the growing part of EVs in the United States is the luxury market, and it's subsidized. You can buy a luxury EV, and you can, collect your $7,500 tax credit too, for those that know. And so it gets to a part of the population that can't afford it, but at the same time, they're being subsidized by everybody else, the middle, that maybe they can't afford it and they don't even know it, kind of thing. That's the whole, the equity, the fairness discussion about all of it, which is a whole nother discussion. But, I also wanted to kind of sag into what activity you're seeing in terms of minerals, related to your land transactions and sort of this, transitioning mix idea. What are you seeing or observing in your space?
Outside of the carbon capture space, just
Yeah,
minerals.
yeah, in general, yeah, as it relates to sort of some of the energy transition
Absolutely.
ideas.
I would say bigger attention into the mineral purchasing space than I've seen, well, since I started buying minerals, and that's one component of our company uh, that we do is buy and hold minerals, and have been doing that for a great long while. And I believe extremely strongly in fee-owned minerals, both producing and non-producing. I know there's a lot of companies out there that are agnostic as to where. Uh, there's a lot of benefits to minerals. They very rarely do they, just like real estate, very rarely does it decline in value. The separate, with one caveat, is that minerals aren't taxed until they become producing, at least not in the state of Texas. Now, states like Colorado will tax minerals in place. But those things aside, there's a lot of money moving into large mineral acquisition right now. A lot of big funds have several tranches set up to deploy in buying fee-owned minerals. There's a lot of letters going out, a lot of new AI moving into the space that can acquire data from the comptroller's office and taxing districts and the railroad commission and populate offer letters to send out to landowners. It's becoming very, very competitive. And I think it's because the big money, the smart money, as you called it, sees what's coming. I do as well. We've been fairly active buying minerals in what I call in the mid-continent region, which is Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas primarily,
Yeah, yeah,
because we see a resurgence of drilling activity. Maybe not this year or next, but I think natural gas is going to be the energy source of choice,
yeah,
probably for the remainder of my life.
yeah.
And I think you're really going to see that uh, start to come to fruition. And I think a lot of people understand that you're going to see an increase, an uptick in natural gas drilling and production here in the next 5 years.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with you at all on that. And a lot of it is probably because of global demand. The rest of the world, the developing world, demands natural gas.
Right.
It's a source of base load, for electricity, power gen. And you still have to have it with renewables because the battery storage is just not there. And we don't know when it's going to get there. And battery storage and all that requires all the minerals that are competing in renewables and everything else, and EV batteries, all of it.
Right.
So there's a certain kind of like natural headwinds on some of that, and hence the need for natural gas. And
Well, and we live in times now where, in my opinion, I don't think the word is too strong to use weaponize, the weaponization of oil. Saudi Arabia at OPEC's done it to us since its creation. We've lived this world for 50 years of the ability to stranglehold the supply to effectuate the market that it wants. And it's a unilateral relationship that it has with the United States, the Middle East, and the United States. It's not bilateral. We don't have the same effect on them. We saw that happen over the last 2 years with natural gas of what happened in Russia. So I think the global market, to your point, is going to be enormous. And I think people are going to probably keep it that way to alleviate their dependency on natural gas from Russia, is looking for other sources. And who better to call on than the United States? And the hubs that are going in and already exist to liquefy it and get it out and export it are huge. And there's such an abundance of it, which is why the price is so low right now.
Yeah.
And there's an abundance in reserves. You don't hear a lot of discussion about it, but the tracking of the mineral funds that are moving into it should tell you nothing but that they envision an increase in domestic drilling for natural gas and production. And I believe that they're right.
Yeah, I mean, with MidCon specifically, I know that, like, for example, the Permian is, it has largely been notoriously more oil weighted. And MidCon, I guess, is it gassier than oil, or is it split?
I
Or
say mid-con. It is in the region in which I sit in the Anadarko Basin
yeah,
and
Anadarko.
the Guyman Hugoton field, some of those large gas fields in the northern Texas panhandle.
Yeah.
If I had to categorize mid-continent as a whole, and I'm just going off of my own interest, they're predominantly more oil. We get more revenue off of oil production, but they're real shallow oil plays, most of this out of Kansas and Oklahoma. Um, as far as the apportionment throughout mid-con, I traditionally associate it with an oil play, but certainly in Texas Panhandle. Now you get into the Haynesville and East Texas and those regions, you're going to see a resurgence in those areas as well, and that's why I think you see, operators like Comstock being so active in that area. They have a huge position down there, and so do several others. It's got a great pipeline infrastructure, a lot of large holdings that have been HBP for a long time. Just a lot of good things to happen in natural gas.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Haynesville is very active, and in fact, the Haynesville has redressed some of the issues with the Marcellus's lack of takeaway capacity. The Haynesville, and like you said, it's because it is, located near really good infrastructure, and it can more easily be exported as well. But one other thing before I get to a concluding area. So back to some of these announcements. One announcement that we talked about a little bit that sort of struck me was Exxon's announcement about buying and beginning this lithium processing.
Oh, and the
Smackover formation, and it's Arkansas and Louisiana, Texas is where it covers, but I think it's largely they're looking at Arkansas for the location, I believe.
Right.
What are your thoughts about that particular event?
I try not to have any, just because with the authenticity, I try to bring what I do talk about. As I think we've talked about before, I really am only going to talk about things I've actually touched and been involved with on a firsthand basis. Now, lithium has become one of them, at least in communication and to some extent transactionally. I've had several people actually reach out in the last month with that Exxon article and asked, "Hey, did you hear about Exxon's acquisition of the Smackover?"
Yeah.
And I think the question that came out of it, and we actually have a thread going amongst myself and two other very capable natural resource attorneys, was how are we going to categorize lithium? Is it legally a mineral if it's found in a saline reservoir that's traditionally treated as waste, which is why we dispose saltwater disposal in it from oil and gas activities? Or is it going to be associated with part of the hard surface with the subterranean? And that was the subject line of the email, lithium mineral ? And we really haven't reached a conclusion based on sound case law. It really depends on how you find it and where. And I would say 60% of our carbon storage projects with respect to the land component, we're encountering a simultaneous lithium extraction component. A landowner that has already been contacted about signing a saltwater extraction lease for the purpose of obtaining lithium bromide. And I know of its utilization in batteries. I think the lithium battery is going to be here for a while, in spite of the fact that there's a lot of alternatives out there, different types of fuel cells that are being experimented with. I just know that lithium is highly coveted. It's very limited in supply, certainly domestically. A lot of people are moving into that space like a whole lot of other ones. But as far as it's really, how is it going to be treated in conjunction with other concurrent development has been my main concern. Who's going to have priority? Who's going to have ownership to it? And how do we all concurrently develop, which is the buzzword I like, because we're encountering that with just about everything we do now as Texas gets really crowded and lots of different energy development ideas are moving here, and they're all necessary. Where is lithium extraction and mining going to fit into that? But yeah, to answer your question, the word Smackover, which I was not previously familiar with, has come across my wire more than 4 or 5 times over the summer.
I think because of that announcement, it was like, oh wow, that's the first time you've really heard such an explicit into lithium. of course, we've heard, of Exxon's forays into CCS, and, long ago it was algae as a biofuel. And, it just seems like, various companies are trying to pick their direction, of
Yeah.
this, of their alternatives, of what their alternative space is going to look like. And so also I think we talked about this, but if you had any sort of additional comments about it, from a land perspective, I know we talked about how you're seeing this complementariness between, oil and gas assets, renewables, all can be happening on the same, tracts of land.
Right.
And then you're talking about minerals as well. So if you had to pick your energy mix favorites, or not favorites, but just what you see more activity in. I mean, what do you see in terms of activity in the all of the above mix?
Right. We have done really dependent upon where transmission is. The most activity that I've seen of actually dirt moving has been solar,
Mm.
and primarily east of the I-35 corridor, southeast of Dallas. Now, there could very easily be projects. I'm not going to speak generally on the industry because I don't know, but from what we have been observing, it has been deep West Texas and the Northeast region of Texas, where there's an incredible amount of already existing transmission. There wasn't a whole lot of incentives in the IRA. There's none. And certainly in the 88th legislature in Texas at the state level for new transmission. So the existing transmission and existing substations in Texas are becoming more and more coveted, especially near these highly populated areas. Dallas, of course, is one. There could be, I'm sure there's projects developing near Houston as well. But that seems to be getting the largest from based on what I've seen. I hear of drilling programs that are moving along in the Permian Basin, and I think that you mentioned this word earlier, and I wrote it down. Despite the momentum of project financing and project development, we're still suffering through a lot of supply chain issues that are holding back pipe, solar components, certainly pumping units and compressors for CO2 distribution and transmission. That's still going to be a large variable. I think we're going to probably start to reconcile that internally. At least that's my hope, that at some point we really start handling a lot of these supply chain issues with more domestic manufacturing. That's really going to be dependent heavily on what happens in 24 and the federal election. But that's still a very large hold up for a lot of development, more so than I think people realize, is supply chain and manpower. And we have a labor problem in the United States that affects everything. Despite some of these lofty expectations and the big money that's moving in, it's still hard to find people in parts. And if you have it, you can get them. That's probably going to be a big deciding factor. If you've already got an existing drilling rig and you've already got pipe somewhere, you're probably going to have a lot more success than somebody who's waiting on it.
Right.
And that certainly is true. If you ordered your solar components prior to 2020, you're going to be a lot more well suited to develop your projects. We have a lot of timetables that we have for internal projects and people that we do business with that are not going to be realistically realized in time, specifically because of supply chain. So that's going to be a large variable, and that's what I'm seeing as far as projects that are moving forward. Not necessarily which industry you're in, but whether you have the materials to develop your ideas right now and when you can get them if you don't.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's a whole new wrinkle that's really not been talked about, just with the timelines for CCS, that, yeah, supply chain issues, aside from all the things that you said have to work in concert with each other on a timeline, if you can't get the supplies, that's sort of like, yeah, that's also delaying. So would you say that, we talked about this before, but just that, CCS, it's just going to take time, and it's going to take time, And, it sounds like you're not completely unhappy about it, just so that, some of the smartness, and the economic rationale starts
Right.
to emerge, in time, more
Yeah,
rational.
no, excitement is a good word. I've been excited from day one. I think everybody needs to be. I'm a believer, and so is everybody that we work around. But it's going to take an appropriate amount of time. I think I've told somebody, go look at a power plant, just park your car outside and look at it. There's nothing about it that speaks expedience. It's long to build, it's long to supply, it takes a long time to get ramped up and burn things. These are just going to be very large course corrections. And I don't, in any new idea that shows up politically and in the media, and obviously all of this comes in under the climate change momentum. We think there's a certain immediacy that needs to be obtained and can be, but that's just not the case. It really is. It's going to take a lot longer, and I think you're going to see more people be more authentic about it in areas of leadership that have committed themselves to these agendas. Is we're still 100% on board with decarbonizing, but it is going to take a long time. We're talking about laying pipes and building new equipment, and that's one of the things that's unique about CO2 components is for moving carbon dioxide. Some of these compressors don't exist. The
Mm,
parts don't. There's not an abundance of centrifugal compressors that are needed to move CO2, at 1,100 pounds per square inch. A lot of these things have to be built.
mhm,
And so you're not only talking about supply chain problems for existing components, but on top of that, in carbon dioxide, a lot of these are going to be brand new.
mhm.
And so just the raw materials to build and design gives an added level to sort of the lengthy timetables that we're looking at.
Yeah. Yeah. And that sort of gets to, I mean, really, this should be looked at instead of just, you can just shift into hydrogen or shift into, CCS or this. It this this is infrastructure development.
That's
Infrastructure
right.
development by its very nature, it is a long-lived asset. It takes a long time to build, operate, these facilities, and we're talking about new infrastructure. But CCS also leverages past knowledge. We have some of the pieces of it, like you said, through like Denbury, and just various forms. It's there. It's just figuring out what's the most economic route and technologically doable and all that. But was there anything else that you wanted to add that you feel like we didn't really get to, or that's you wanted to emphasize?
There's one final topic that we touched on it just briefly before when we were talking about maybe stranded emissions, stranded emitters where there was a lack of supply of of water for cooling and power statewide. And I sometimes I have to catch myself that I'm talking about absolutes. This is purely specific to Texas because I can't speak about other states in which I don't work in. Is that the real threshold conversation that has not started yet is with respect to carbon capture and storage and also with hydrogen is how are we going to trade power or create more power and just how much of it? On an emitter by emitter basis, the parasitic energy load for carbon capture is about 25%. I mean, you could apply that statewide theoretically if you were to implement carbon capture on every industrial emitter that's putting out CO2. But for 1,000 megawatt power plant, you're going to have to come up with an additional 250 megawatts of power, or you're going to have to trade that amount. What does that discussion look like in a state that has set 4 records since June? And I may be repeating myself. I don't know. I don't think we touched upon this last time.
No.
Since June for the draw on the grid, we're
Yeah.
just south of 85,000, maybe eclipsed it. With these new record temperatures, but also with more and more people, not only here, but more and more people staying inside
Yeah.
and running air conditioners all summer, are we prepared and how so to trade foreseeably maybe 15 to 20% of that load so that we can decarbonize? And are we prepared to build that additional power source? We kind of have to handle that conversation
Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
All of these ideas look great. They've got challenges that we've talked about. They've got benefits that we've talked about, and they've got risks. But until we decide how are we going to turn all this stuff on in the midst of a grid that appears to be peaking
Yeah.
more and more and more every year, uh, that's just an intelligent dialogue that nobody's really having at the trade associations and the groups that I'm going to see at conferences and even in business discussions. Is we really want to decarbonize. That's great. We need to talk about the parasitic load that this is going to put on not only your facility, but on the larger grid that already has, basically the eyes of the country on it. When's the next time Texas is going to fail?
Yeah.
And it's an authentic conversation, I think.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, I started working on that idea a little bit last fall and kind of have carried the idea of it. And basically, and I have this conversation with a good friend who was an early wind developer, and it's the trade-offs. Everything has a trade-off. Wind has a
Yes.
trade-off. It's
Mm-hmm.
intermittent. It's solar. And then when you add all the solar onto the Texas grid, all of that what is it, congestion costs, and all those
The
things.
transmission congestion costs. Yeah, this stuff has to all go somewhere.
It's like $3 billion a year that it cost the energy, residents
Mhm.
of Texas, $3 billion. And it also, what you're talking about is the need for excess energy to decarbonize. It costs money to decarbonize. It costs energy to decarbonize in certain ways, in some of the
Mhm.
ways we're talking about. And I think the example people can wrap their head around is like Bitcoin. We know that those Bitcoin, facilities suck up a ton of power, and they're asked to stop when we do have grid conditions. So what does that tell you? It's the same thing with AI requires a ton of computing power, which requires a ton of energy, to have the cooling,
Yeah.
the cloud, and the data centers. And so everything is additional. And I think that's something I've been talking about in some of my videos on AI, chips and energy, and different things after the Fed, is this very conversation, because it is it lies in the realm of economics. Trade-offs is a classic economic, equation.
Right.
And so I think that's what you're getting at. But that's an interesting, that an additional 15 to 20% could be needed. I mean, that's kind of the number you're just thinking.
On average, yeah.
That's a lot, that's a lot,
It's an enormous amount of power in a state where, ERCOT has come on and asked people to please turn their thermostats up. If that's the measure, that it doesn't really give you a sense of it doesn't instill a lot of confidence. I think that's probably a good tactic to employ or a good strategy. But you read a statement like that and it doesn't really make you feel all safe and warm. You're going to feel warm if you have to turn your thermostat up. But is this really the time that we need to be bolting on a whole bunch of other draws on the grid? And if not, what is the plan for wind and solar, or maybe even more fossil fuel generation? You
Yeah.
find yourself very quickly kind of chasing your tail.
Yeah, well, it gets back to the attempts of the state plan that happened after that advisory committee and all that those findings that happened after Winter Storm Uri.
Agree.
And there's like a 109-page document. I have it. I've read some of it, of all the tension between all the different players. Of even trying to figure this out. Really complicated, because you get to the politics of it all. And
Really complicated political fight stalemate is what came out of Uri. As everybody put out a report about why it wasn't their fault. And I honestly do believe, and I'm not criticizing anybody. We're probably getting off topic. I am going to interject an opinion, is that we may not be as far away from those conditions as we realize.
right.
And in fact, we've had a nice, 2-year stint of a lot of emotional, a lot of lawsuits have been filed, and But what is the solution forward? We got a lot of things on the table right now. Carbon capture has got an enormous amount of attention. Between renewables and fossil fuels, what are we doing for the state of Texas to make sure that it's safe for all of the people going forward in both seasons, the extreme hot and the extreme cold?
Yeah.
Let's handle the power supply problem first.
Yeah.
And then let's talk about all the bells and whistles that we're going to try to bolt on to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's a real conversation. I mean, that's reality, because it's where people live. It's the human
Sure.
part of it
Yeah.
that we've talked
Right.
about a little bit in the past. But I think that's a good place to end this on 9/11, with
Absolutely.
a sense of, what do we need, and how do we pull together to make this happen. And Texas is a great case study for all this, because we have all of it going on, and we have a lot of innovation, entrepreneurial thinking, like your firm. What you're doing is, commendable. And
Yeah.
I just want to, was there
We're
any?
we're
Yeah.
we're a good test study, but we're also a good leader. So goes Texas, and so goes the rest of the country. So we need to be careful about the path we set, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time and
Pleasure always.
enlightening us about carbon capture in the state of, once again. Thanks so much.